The lights of the congressional hearing room blazed down on Jasmine Crockett, the freshman Democratic representative from Texas. Her royal purple suit stood in stark contrast to the wood-paneled backdrop as she shuffled her notes, preparing for what was supposed to be a routine oversight committee hearing. But today would be anything but routine. Across the room, Kash Patel, former Defense Department Chief of Staff under President Trump, sat with a confident smirk playing across his face. His navy suit was impeccably pressed, his red tie a bold statement of his continued allegiance. He had been called to testify about government transparency, but he came with another agenda entirely. The committee chairperson had barely finished introducing the day's proceedings when Patel leaned forward to his microphone. Before we begin, I'd like to address something, he said, his voice carrying an edge that immediately silenced the room. Representative Crockett has been making accusations about the previous administration that are not just false, but dangerous to national security. The room froze. Camera operators zoomed in on Crockett's face, expecting shock, perhaps fear. Instead, they captured something unexpected, a slight smile forming at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't surprised. She was ready. What happened next left the entire committee speechless. In just 90 seconds, Jasmine Crockett would deliver a response so precise, so backed by evidence, that it wouldn't just defend her position, it would completely dismantle Kash Patel's credibility in front of the entire nation. Before we dive into this incredible political showdown, hit that subscribe button and like this video so you won't miss our latest breaking stories of political confrontations that change the game. Now let's see exactly how Congresswoman Crockett turned what was meant to be her ambush into Patel's most humiliating public moment. To understand the magnitude of this confrontation, you need to know who these two political figures are and why this clash matters so much in today's divided America. Kash Patel had built his reputation as a fierce Trump loyalist, rising from obscurity to become one of the most powerful figures in national security. His resume was impressive on paper. Department of Defense Chief of Staff, Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, and Principal Deputy to the Acting Director of National Intelligence. A former federal prosecutor and national security official, Patel had positioned himself as a defender of transparency and accountability, at least when it came to investigating his political opponents. Behind the scenes, though, many questioned Patel's motivations. Critics pointed to his efforts to discredit the Russia investigation and his last-minute Pentagon appointment after Trump's election defeat as signs that his loyalty was to a person rather than to democratic principles. Still, to his supporters, Patel remained a patriot, unafraid to challenge what they saw as corruption in the political establishment. Jasmine Crockett presented a stark contrast. The freshman representative from Texas had risen from a background as a civil rights attorney, public defender, and state legislator. Her direct, no-nonsense approach had quickly made her a rising star among progressives. Where Patel was calculated and strategic, Crockett was authentic and blunt. She had built her reputation not through Washington power networks, but through grassroots activism and legal advocacy for underserved communities. What many people didn't know about Crockett, though, was her meticulous preparation. Behind her passionate speeches was a lawyer's mind that collected facts, documented inconsistencies, and prepared for exactly the kind of ambush Patel was attempting. As the hearing began, tension filled the room. Staffers whispered nervously to each other, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. The committee chairperson tried to regain control, but Patel continued his unexpected offensive. Representative Crockett has repeatedly accused the previous administration of wrongdoing without evidence, Patel said, his voice steady and practiced. She's built her social media following by spreading conspiracy theories about people who served their country honorably. I think the American people deserve better than these baseless attacks from someone with so little experience in national security matters. The Republican members of the committee nodded in agreement, some smiling as if they'd been anticipating this moment. Several Democrats looked concerned, glancing toward Crockett with uncertainty. Attacking a witness wasn't standard procedure, and they wondered how their colleague would handle this breach of protocol. For her part, Crockett remained calm. Those seated closest to her noticed she wasn't frantically flipping through her notes or looking to senior members for guidance. Instead, she opened a slim blue folder that had been sitting in front of her since the hearing began. A congressional aide would later tell reporters, "I've never seen someone so calm in the face of what was clearly a coordinated attack." It was like she knew exactly what was coming. Patel wasn't finished. I think we need to address this now, before the hearing proceeds, because these kinds of accusations undermine public trust in our institutions, and frankly, he added with a hint of condescension in his voice, they show a fundamental misunderstanding of how national security operations actually work. The committee chairperson, finally regaining their composure, turned to Crockett. Representative Crockett, would you like to respond before we return to the scheduled agenda? All eyes in the room turned to Jasmine Crockett. Camera operators adjusted their focus, reporters leaned forward in the press section, social media managers for various political organizations prepared to capture whatever happened next. Crockett adjusted her microphone, took a sip of water, and looked directly at Patel. What the nation was about to witness wasn't just a response to an attack. It was a masterclass in political accountability that would forever change how people viewed both Kash Patel and Jasmine Crockett. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," Crockett began, her voice measured but firm. "And thank you, Mr. Patel, for giving me this opportunity to address your concerns directly." She opened the blue folder in front of her, revealing meticulously organized documents with colored tabs extending from the edges. "Mr. Patel claims I've made baseless accusations about the previous administration. That's an interesting perspective from someone who played a central role in what many have called one of the most chaotic transitions of power in American history." Several committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't going to be the easy deflection some had anticipated. "But since you've decided to make this personal," Crockett continued, "let's talk about facts, not accusations. On December 18, 2020, you were appointed as Chief of Staff to the Acting Secretary of Defense. Is that correct?" Patel nodded. "Yes, that's public knowledge. And during your tenure in that position, did you not delay critical security briefings to the incoming administration? Briefings that even Republican national security experts said were essential to maintaining our national defense continuity?" Patel's expression hardened. "That characterization is false. There were established procedures." Crockett cut him off, something rarely seen in committee hearings. "I'm not asking about procedures, Mr. Patel. I'm asking about your actions. Let me be more specific." She pulled out the first document from her folder. "This is a letter signed by 9 former defense secretaries, including 2 who served under President Trump, expressing alarm about the Pentagon's transition delays. Would you like me to read their concerns about your conduct specifically?" The room fell completely silent. Patel's confident demeanor visibly faltered. "I don't think that's necessary," he said. "The transition ultimately proceeded as required by law." "As required by law is an interesting standard," Crockett replied, her voice gaining strength. "Let's talk about your claims regarding transparency, since that's supposedly why you're here today." She pulled another document from her folder. "This is your sworn testimony from May 2021, where you stated, and I quote, 'I have always prioritized transparency in government operations.' Would you stand by that statement today?" "Absolutely," Patel responded, recovering some of his composure. "My record speaks for itself." "Indeed it does," Crockett said with a slight smile, "which makes this next document particularly interesting." She held up a third paper. "This is an internal memo with your signature dated January 5, 2021, instructing Defense Department officials to, quote, 'limit information sharing with the transition team regarding ongoing operations in sensitive areas.' Can you explain how this memo aligns with your commitment to transparency?" Whispers erupted across the hearing room. A Republican committee member attempted to interject with a point of order, but the chairperson, clearly captivated by the exchange, allowed Crockett to continue. Patel's face flushed slightly. "That memo has been taken completely out of context. There were legitimate national security considerations." "National security considerations that 9 former defense secretaries didn't share?" Crockett interrupted. "National security considerations that career military officials testified were unprecedented and potentially dangerous?" She pulled out yet another document. "This is testimony from General Mark Miller, stating that your actions during the transition created, and I quote, 'unnecessary risks to national security operations.' Is General Miller also spreading conspiracy theories, Mr. Patel?" The tension in the room was palpable. Journalists were furiously taking notes. Several committee members who had initially seemed supportive of Patel were now avoiding eye contact with him, but Crockett wasn't finished. She was methodically building towards something bigger. Mr. Patel, you began your career as a public defender, as did I. We both took oaths to uphold the Constitution. So let me ask you directly, when you worked to block the peaceful transfer of power, something fundamental to our constitutional system, what oath were you honoring? Patel's expression darkened. That's a false premise. I never worked to block the transfer of power. I'm here to discuss government transparency, not to be subjected to a character assassination based on partisan talking points. Crockett nodded slowly. I understand you'd prefer to discuss other matters, but you chose to question my integrity and the accuracy of my statements. So let's be perfectly clear about who is dealing in facts and who is dealing in partisan talking points. She turned to her colleagues. Members of the committee, what we're witnessing is a classic deflection strategy. Mr. Patel knows that his record can't withstand serious scrutiny, so he's attempting to undermine those who question him. It's a tactic familiar to every prosecutor and defense attorney in America. Turning back to Patel, she continued, you were involved in efforts to promote false narratives about election fraud. You participated in meetings where plans to obstruct the certification of electoral votes were discussed. And now you're here presenting yourself as a champion of government transparency? The Republican ranking member finally managed to interject. Mr. Chair, these accusations are well beyond the scope of today's hearing. Representative Crockett is turning this into a political circus rather than focusing on the important oversight issues we're here to address. The chairperson nodded. I appreciate the ranking member's concern. Representative Crockett, please try to connect your questions to the matter at hand. Crockett smiled. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are directly relevant to government transparency, which is precisely why Mr. Patel is here today. In fact, I have just one more document to share that I believe ties everything together perfectly. She reached into her folder and pulled out a final paper, holding it up for everyone to see. The room collectively leaned forward, anticipating what could possibly be the culmination of this extraordinary exchange. Mr. Patel, are you familiar with this document? As Patel squinted to see what she was holding, his face suddenly lost all color. The document in Crockett's hand was about to change everything about this hearing, and potentially about Kash Patel's entire public legacy. This, Crockett said, her voice clear and deliberate, is an email sent from your personal account on January 4th, 2021, to several officials at the Department of Defense. She looked directly at Patel. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to explain its contents yourself? Patel's jaw tightened. I can't confirm the authenticity of any document you're holding without examining it first. Of course, Crockett nodded. Let me help refresh your memory. She began to read. We need to control the narrative regarding the 20th. POTUS is counting on us to make sure the evidence of irregularities remains front and center. The transition protocols give us significant latitude. Use it. A collective gasp rippled through the hearing room. Several committee members sat up straighter, suddenly much more attentive. Mr. Patel, Crockett continued, this email was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, the very type of transparency measure you claim to champion. It was authenticated by the Department of Defense Inspector General's office last month. Would you like to revise your earlier statements about your commitment to a smooth transition of power? The room fell into a stunned silence. Patel's face, once confident and composed, now showed visible strain. He leaned toward his microphone, then pulled back, glancing toward the Republican side of the committee as if seeking support. That email, he finally began, his voice slightly hoarse, lacks important context. We were concerned about maintaining operational security during a volatile period. Operational security? Crockett raised an eyebrow. Or political security for the outgoing president? Because this email makes no mention of national security concerns. Instead, it explicitly refers to controlling the narrative and keeping evidence of irregularities, which multiple courts had already rejected, front and center. She leaned forward. Mr. Patel, you began this hearing by questioning my credibility. You suggested I was spreading conspiracy theories, but this email, your email, shows that you were actively involved in promoting actual conspiracy theories from one of the highest national security positions in our government. Crockett turned to address the entire committee. Colleagues, this isn't just about Mr. Patel's actions during the transition. This is about the integrity of our oversight process. How can we trust the testimony of someone who used their official position to undermine the very democratic processes we're sworn to protect? The committee chairperson, clearly struggling to maintain procedural order amidst this bombshell revelation, finally spoke up. "Mr. Patel, would you like to respond to the document Representative Crockett has presented?" Patel adjusted his tie, visibly trying to regain his composure. "As I've said, this email represents internal discussions about managing public communications during a challenging transition period. It's being mischaracterized for political purposes." "Mischaracterized?" Crockett's voice carried a blend of disbelief and determination. She picked up another document. "Then perhaps you can explain this message you sent 2 days later, on January 6th, just hours before the Capitol was breached." She read aloud, "Delay tactics working. Keep information compartmentalized. Legal options still on the table per conversation with POTUS team this AM." The hearing room erupted in murmurs. Several journalists rushed out, presumably to report on this revelation. Republican members huddled together in hurried consultation, while Democrats exchanged shocked glances. "Mr. Patel," Crockett continued, her voice rising above the commotion, "these aren't conspiracy theories. These are your words, written while you held a position of immense public trust. You weren't acting as a private citizen exercising free speech rights. You were a senior government official, using your power to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power, all while taking an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Patel's face had gone from concerned to ashen. "I need to consult with counsel before responding further," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's certainly your right," Crockett nodded. "But the American people deserve answers. You came here today presenting yourself as a champion of government transparency while attacking my credibility. Yet these documents show that you were actively working to undermine our democratic processes." She gathered her papers, tapping them once on the table to align them neatly before returning them to her folder. "Chair, I yield my remaining time, but I'd like to enter these emails and the supporting authentication documents into the official record." The chairperson, still visibly processing what had just transpired, nodded mechanically. "Without objection." The committee room remained in stunned silence. What had begun as Kash Patel's attempt to ambush Representative Crockett had transformed into one of the most devastating counterpunches in recent political history. Cameras captured it all, Patel's ashen face as he whispered urgently with his attorney, Republican committee members looking shell-shocked, Democrats trying to maintain professional composure despite the bombshell moment, and Jasmine Crockett calmly organizing her notes as if she'd just finished a routine questioning rather than executing a political masterstroke. As the chairperson called for a 15-minute recess, reporters rushed from the room. Within minutes, news alerts began popping up on phones throughout the building. Rep. Crockett reveals damning Patel emails in hearing showdown, and explosive documents show former Trump officials' role in transition obstruction. But the full impact of what Jasmine Crockett had just accomplished was still unfolding. When the hearing resumed, nothing would be the same. Not for Kash Patel, not for the Oversight Committee, and certainly not for the freshman representative who had just announced her presence in Washington in the most dramatic way possible. The 15-minute recess stretched to 45 as committee members from both parties huddled in separate rooms, strategizing how to handle the bombshell revelations. Journalists lined the hallways, desperately trying to get comments from anyone exiting either meeting. Inside the hearing room, a skeletal crew of staffers remained, whispering among themselves as they glanced at Jasmine Crockett, who sat reviewing notes as if it were just another day in Congress. When the committee finally reconvened, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The Republican members returned with tight expressions, some refusing to make eye contact with Patel. The Democrats entered with carefully maintained neutral expressions, though occasional exchanged glances revealed their awareness that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Most telling was Kash Patel himself. Gone was the confident, slightly smug demeanor he had displayed at the beginning of the hearing. In its place was a man visibly struggling to maintain his composure, flanked now by two attorneys who hadn't been present earlier. The chairperson cleared his throat. "The committee will come to order. Before we continue with scheduled questioning, Mr. Patel has requested an opportunity to address the documents presented by Representative Crockett. Patel leaned into his microphone, his voice noticeably strained. After consultation with counsel, I need to clarify that the emails presented earlier were part of broader communications taken out of context. I have always acted in accordance with my oath of office and in the best interests of national security. That said, on advice of counsel, I will be invoking my Fifth Amendment right regarding specific questions about these communications going forward. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Invoking the Fifth Amendment wasn't an admission of guilt, but in the court of public opinion, especially after Patel's confident offensive at the hearing's start, it landed like a thunderclap. The committee chairperson, clearly struggling with the unprecedented turn of events, looked at his notes. Given these developments, and after consultation with the ranking member, we will adjourn today's hearing and reconvene at a later date. Mr. Patel, you remain under subpoena and will be recalled when the committee resumes this matter. And just like that, the hearing that Kash Patel had entered as an accuser ended with him departing as the accused. As he gathered his papers and hurriedly exited with his legal team, cameras captured every step of his retreat. Outside the hearing room, the political earthquake continued to spread. Crockett receipts began trending nationwide within an hour. Cable news channels interrupted their regular programming for special coverage, playing the clip of Crockett reading Patel's emails over and over. Political analysts who had barely known Jasmine Crockett's name that morning were now dissecting her strategic brilliance and speculating about her future in Democratic politics. By evening, the full scope of the aftermath was becoming clear. Three distinct narratives emerged across the media landscape. On progressive outlets, Crockett was being celebrated as a hero who had exposed concrete evidence of efforts to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. What Representative Crockett did today wasn't just political theater, said one MSNBC analyst. She provided documented evidence of something many have suspected but couldn't prove, that high-ranking officials were actively working to obstruct the transition while publicly claiming to follow proper protocols. Conservative media took a different approach. Some hosts attempted to downplay the significance of the emails, arguing they showed nothing more than standard transition tensions. Others focused on procedural complaints, questioning how Crockett had obtained the documents and whether they had been properly vetted. A few simply avoided mentioning the hearing at all, focusing instead on other news stories. Mainstream news outlets tried to thread the needle, acknowledging the explosive nature of the revelations while carefully noting that the full context of the communications remained unclear. While Representative Crockett presented compelling evidence, a CNN correspondent reported, the abrupt adjournment of the hearing means many questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that today marked a significant escalation in the ongoing investigations of the events surrounding January 6th. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath brought both opportunity and challenge. Her social media following doubled overnight. Interview requests flooded her office. Senior Democratic leaders who had previously given the freshman representative little attention were suddenly finding time in their schedules to meet with her. In her first post-hearing interview with a Texas news station from her home district, Crockett maintained the same composed demeanor she had shown in the hearing room. Today wasn't about political theater, she explained. It was about accountability. Mr. Patel came to that hearing expecting to use his platform to attack those asking legitimate questions about actions taken during a critical period in our nation's history. What he didn't expect was that someone would come prepared with documented evidence rather than just opinions. When asked about how she had obtained the emails, Crockett was direct. These weren't secret documents I mysteriously acquired. They were obtained through completely legal and standard FOIA requests that anyone could have filed. The real question isn't how I got these public records, it's why more people weren't looking for them in the first place. For Kash Patel, the fallout was swift and severe. Law firms where he had served as a consultant began quietly distancing themselves. Speaking engagements were canceled. A book deal he had recently signed was suddenly under review by the publisher. Former Trump administration officials who had been close allies issued carefully worded statements about waiting for all the facts before making judgments. 3 days after the hearing, Patel finally issued a statement through his attorney. The recent congressional hearing has resulted in a fundamental mischaracterization of my actions during the presidential transition. The selectively presented communications lack essential context regarding the legitimate national security concerns that informed my decisions. I look forward to providing a complete account of my actions when appropriate, and remain confident that a full review will demonstrate my unwavering commitment to the Constitution and rule of law. The statement did little to stem the bleeding. Political reporters noted that the careful wording avoided directly denying the authenticity of the emails or explaining the damning language they contained. A week after the hearing, the ripple effects continued to spread. The Department of Justice acknowledged that they were reviewing the materials presented at the congressional hearing, bureaucratic language that typically signaled a preliminary assessment of whether further investigation was warranted. The Defense Department Inspector General announced an expanded review of transition activities following the 2020 election. Perhaps most significantly, other congressional committees began issuing new subpoenas to former officials who had served alongside Patel, suggesting that Crockett's revelations had opened new avenues of inquiry that multiple oversight bodies were now pursuing. Social media remained ablaze with memes and analyses of the confrontation. Video clips showing Patel's confident opening attack, juxtaposed with his stunned reaction to Crockett's evidence, were viewed millions of times. Hashtags like "receipts ready" and "Crockett's destruction" trended repeatedly as new audiences discovered the footage. Political strategists from both parties recognized that something fundamental had shifted. What Representative Crockett demonstrated wasn't just a political win, noted a veteran Democratic consultant. She showed a model for how to effectively counter the kind of bombastic attacks that have often left Democrats flat-footed. She came with receipts, not just rhetoric, and that made all the difference. Even some conservative commentators grudgingly acknowledged the effectiveness of Crockett's approach. "Whatever you think of the politics involved," said a Republican strategist on a Sunday talk show, "you have to admit that Representative Crockett executed a nearly flawless tactical response. She let her opponent overextend, remained calm, and then delivered a knockout punch backed by documented evidence." There are lessons there for anyone in politics. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the hearing marked a transformation of her political standing. Once seen primarily as a freshman representative still learning Washington's ways, she was now viewed as a skilled political operator who had orchestrated one of the most effective congressional hearing moments in recent memory. When she returned to her Texas district for a previously scheduled town hall the following weekend, the typically modest community center was overflowing with constituents. They greeted her with a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. "I didn't go to Washington to make headlines," she told the crowd after the applause finally subsided. "I went there to make a difference. What happened at that hearing wasn't about me or Mr. Patel. It was about our fundamental obligation to seek truth and demand accountability from those who serve in positions of public trust." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "The documents I presented weren't secrets I magically discovered. They were public records that anyone could have requested. The real story isn't that I had those emails. It's that for too long, too few people were asking for them in the first place." As Crockett continued her remarks, news alerts buzzed on phones throughout the audience. The Justice Department had just announced the formation of a special investigative team to examine potential obstruction during the presidential transition, a direct result of the evidence Crockett had introduced at the hearing. 2 months later, a comprehensive report would reveal dozens more emails showing a coordinated effort by multiple officials, including Patel, to impede the presidential transition while publicly claiming to follow proper protocols. 6 former officials would eventually face professional consequences, ranging from bar association reviews to criminal charges. But the most lasting impact wasn't in the specific consequences for individual officials. It was in how Jasmine Crockett had changed the template for accountability in American politics. She had demonstrated that with meticulous preparation, strategic patience, and a lawyer's attention to documented evidence, it was possible to cut through the noise of political theater and expose genuine wrongdoing, even when facing a seemingly more powerful opponent. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Kash Patel would be studied in political science classes for years to come, not just for its dramatic flair, but for how it represented a turning point in congressional oversight. It wasn't enough anymore to make accusations or counter-accusations. The new standard was "bring your receipts," a phrase that became so associated with Crockett that supporters began bringing actual receipt papers to her events for her to sign. As the story of the confrontation spread, It transcended partisan politics to become something more universal, a David and Goliath tale for the modern political age, where preparation and evidence triumphed over bluster and intimidation. In political circles, getting crocketed entered the lexicon as shorthand for being devastatingly countered with undeniable evidence. For her part, Crockett remained focused on her work, leveraging her new prominence to advance the policy priorities she had campaigned on. The attention is useful only if I can translate it into results for the people who sent me to Washington, she told a reporter who asked about her newfound celebrity status. But in private moments, even she would acknowledge the significance of what had happened. Sometimes, she told a group of young legal interns visiting her office, you have to be willing to stand your ground when someone tries to bully you, especially when you know you've done the work and have the facts on your side. That hearing wasn't about scoring political points. It was about showing that in the end, evidence matters more than assertions. Preparation trumps posturing, and the truth has a power all its own.